Hello, welcome to the lecture for Chapter 6, which focuses on the blood system. There are multiple objectives for this chapter. First and foremost, to explain the functions of the hematologic system. Then identifying the major components of the blood, differentiating between the four blood types, identifying medical specialists, identifying medical word parts for the blood system, defining the primary terms related to pathology and treatment, describe the diagnostic task procedures, and then be able to spell the primary terms, pronounce the primary terms, and identify common abbreviations related to the blood system. The functions of the blood system. So I think this one's one that you probably understand fairly well, but the idea is that it will function in delivering oxygen and nutrients to tissues. It transports carbon dioxide, blood cells, immune cells, antibodies, and hormones, and waste products end up in the blood that eventually get filtered then through the liver and kidneys. And it returns carbon dioxide to the lungs so it can be exhaled from the body. Blood system fights inflammation, it regulates skin temperature, and it regulates pH and water balance in the body. So, the function of the blood is to do blank. So as it deliver carbon dioxide to the tissues, deliver oxygen to the tissues, promote inflammation, and remove nutrients from the tissues. So this one's pretty straightforward. We just talked about it. Delivering oxygen to the tissues, correct? So, structures of the blood. So the blood is a fluid tissue. It is 55% of a liquid plasma and 45% of suspended elements. So recently I had a plasma injection in my hip in which they took the blood from my vein in my arm and they spun it down to separate it like you see in this tube here. The 55% that was plasma they put into a syringe and then injected that into the gluteus medius muscle in my hip, which was torn, as well as the labrum in my hip, which was torn, to promote healing. The 45% that was leftover blood cells they discarded rather than reinsert those into my body and risk infection. The 45% is made up of three main things, erythrocytes, which are what we call red blood cells typically, leukocytes, or white blood cells, and these include neutrophils, basophils, eosinophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. And then platelets that are also called thrombocytes. And platelets are very small cells. And I should note that the plasma that was injected in my hip was what's called platelet-rich plasma. And so the platelets were still in that blood sample, but the other blood cells were removed from it. The plasma itself is a straw-colored fluid. 92% of that is water. 8% is other components, so different proteins, albumins, globulins, fibrinogen, and prothrombin. And then there's a serum that's the yellow-colored fluid that if you removed all the cells and all the proteins, you'd still have that serum, the yellow-colored fluid. As far as erythrocytes, these are red blood cells, and they're 45% of the blood volume. They're produced in the bone marrow, that's important to remember, and they transport oxygen. Remember, they're packed full of hemoglobin, and the hemoglobin then attracts oxygen across the lung membranes and then transports the oxygen to the tissues that need it. And then there's erythropoietin, which is a hormone produced in the kidney that promotes the production of erythrocytes in the blood cells. So that's one other element to keep in mind. Then the platelets, either thrombocytes or little cell fragments, they're generally colorless. And they do a lot of things. One of the key things they do is they stop bleeding. They form clots to stop bleeding. All right. We have leukocytes. And the larger ones of those, granulocytes, are ones that are produced upon infection. These include neutrophils, basophils, and eosinophils. You have monocytes, which are the very large ones, and they function by what's called phagocytosis, which is breaking the cells of things that they're trying to break down, such as bacteria. And then B cells that mature and when you need to fight infection. And they create things like immunoglobulins that will destroy the germs. So if we look at hematopoiesis, which is the formation of blood, this is when blood develops in the bone marrow. Okay? So in the hollow part of the bone, there's marrow, and that marrow produces the erythrocytes that start out as reticulocytes, which are immature red blood cells. T cells and B cells are also produced there. These are lymphocytes, and we'll learn more about those in a future lecture on the lymph system. The blood is full of different blood gases, oxygen being a very important one that's delivered that helps the cellular respiration, and carbon dioxide then is the byproduct of cellular respiration and needs to be removed from the blood. Nitrogen is in our blood system, and it's in our blood system at a fairly high concentration, but because it's balanced with the partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmosphere, it doesn't cause a problem unless you go underwater and scuba dive and you end up with excess nitrogen in your blood that then comes out of solution and causes little bubbles in your blood. Hemostasis, is the way to stop and control bleeding. It's an automatic constriction of injured vessels. And then you have mechanical hemostasis, which you can do through using a tourniquet or pressure like other means. And then eventually you have coagulation, which is the blood clots forming. Okay, the blood component that has hemoglobin is, okay, so let's think about this. Hemoglobin, we know, is a molecule that attracts oxygen and transports it in the blood. And I mentioned earlier that one of these types of cells is rich in hemoglobin. I may have called them red blood cells when I did that, but they are the erythrocytes that are rich in hemoglobin. Okay? Hemoglobin is very important for transporting oxygen. All right. You may have heard, or I'm sure you've heard, of blood types. We have 4 main blood types in the human system, and then each one of those has 2 variants essentially. So the types are A, B, AB, and O, as you can see here, and it's defined by what antibodies they have on the surface. So A has ones that are depicted here as green, B has ones that are depicted here as little diamonds, and AB has both of those, whereas then O lacks any antibodies on the surface. Okay. They also have what's called an Rh factor that identifies them as positive or negative. Positive meaning they have the proteins, and negative meaning they lack the proteins. And so your blood type will be something like A positive or O negative, and negative meaning that you do not have the Rh factor proteins. AB positive and AB negative, things like that, are different blood types. Okay? The Rh factor now is an antigen that was first found in rhesus monkeys, so that's why it's called the Rh factor. And about 85% of us have that antigen and are considered Rh positive. There's 15% of the population that do not have the antigen and are Rh negative. Now, if you're an Rh negative woman and you become pregnant with an infant that's Rh positive, then you can have difficulties because the antibodies in your blood system will attack the fetus unless you're given treatment. And the way this works is if you're an Rh negative woman, you have 2 Rh negative genes, and if you then the sperm comes from somebody carrying an Rh positive gene, because Rh positive is dominant it will be expressed. Now, if they discover this, the mother now can be given what's called RhoGAM, which is Rho-D immunoglobulin, and that can really help prevent mothers from producing antibodies that harm the fetus. Okay. Now, matching blood types. When you have a person donating blood, the ideal donor is somebody that has a type O because they have no antigens. Okay, so there are no antigens on their blood cell surfaces, and those then aren't going to be attacked by the antibodies in the receiver's blood. Okay, so if you are Rh positive, you can receive Rh positive or Rh negative. But if you're Rh negative, you can only receive Rh negative blood. What that means then is, to be a universal donor, you have to be type O and Rh negative. So O negative blood is the most widely sought type of blood because it is a universal donor. If you're an AB, you can actually receive any blood type. And the commonality of these, if you look at O plus, O positive and A positive, that's 70% of all people. My grandmother was AB negative, and that's a very rare blood type. And she had to be very careful and make sure that the local hospital, which was in the Upper Peninsula, had a blood supply in case she ended up having issues. There are really some weird blood types out there, but we're going to focus on A and B, AB, and O for this class. So, back to this, what's the universal donor? Okay. So, you want somebody that has no antigens and no Rh factor, so that person is an O negative. All right. So, O negative people are considered to be universal donors, and their blood is highly sought by blood banks. I'm going to talk a little bit about different specialties related to the blood system. So, if you hear somebody be referred to as a hematologist, that person is a physician, a medical doctor, who specializes in treating blood disorders. If you hear of somebody referred to as a phlebotomist, this is a medical professional that's trained to draw blood from patients. And phlebotomists are typically employed in labs where you go get blood draws. Hematologists often are in hospitals where they deal with people with rare blood diseases. Okay? Now, let's go back and try to piece some things together here, okay? The process of creating red blood cells. How would we describe that? So what word parts do we need? So we have a few different beginnings, erythra and hemat and heme, and then oid, poiesis, and stasis and penia as endings, okay? If you go back and you use your memory, you'll remember that poiesis is the creation, and erythro refers to red blood cells. So erythropoiesis is the correct answer here. I'm going to talk just a little bit about pathology of the blood system. There won't be a lot on the exam on this, but you should familiarize yourself with it by going through the class activities. If you have hypercoagulable blood, that is blood that has an increased tendency to form clots. Hyper meaning above, okay? So there are a few different versions of this, but one of the ones you may have heard of is deep vein thrombosis. That's something that can happen if your blood is too frequent to clot, okay? Okay. There's also coagulopathy, And this is a bleeding disorder where coagulation is impaired. Coagulation is what happens when you have an injury and the blood needs to coagulate to stop bleeding. Hemophilia is the most known one of these, and there's a lot of case studies about the royal family in England suffering from hemophilia. It's a hereditary disease most often expressed in males because it's carried on the X chromosome, and males only have one of those. If you get cut, you just bleed, and you don't stop bleeding. Okay? And then von Willebrand's disease is a genetic disease that's mostly females, and this is a low level of clotting protein called von Willebrand factor. And this can cause really heavy bleeding during periods, which is obviously a very big concern. Leukemia is a blood cancer, and it's an increase in abnormal leukocytes in your blood. And they often impair the ability of the bone marrow to make red blood cells and platelets. So a few different kinds. AML, which is acute myeloid leukemia, that's the kind that children often have. CLL, chronic lymphocytic leukemia, is common in adults. Myeloid, growing in the bone marrow, and lymphocytic, bone marrow that produces abnormal lymphocytes. Lymphoma. Lymphoma is another malignancy of the lymph tissues. So Hodgkin's lymphoma, or Hodgkin's disease, is a cancer of the immune system, characterized by what are called Reed-Sternberg cells. The body has trouble fighting infections when you have this, but it is very treatable. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is more serious as far as the treatment outcomes. And this one is usually found in older people, but there's several different varieties, and they start with in the lymphocytes. Then multiple myeloma, also just called myeloma. And this is when you have plasma mutations in cells that become cancerous. Cancerous cells, as all cancers do, multiply out of control and crowd the healthy cells inside the bone marrow. The individuals who have this often have a lot of lesions on their body. You have disorders of blood gases. I mentioned earlier, if you go scuba diving or you're in a pressurized system breathing in air, you get a buildup of nitrogen in your blood, and at normal atmospheric pressure, that oxygen, you get a buildup of nitrogen. At normal atmospheric pressure, that nitrogen comes out of your blood into little tiny air bubbles, and that causes all kinds of issues, including small blood clots. So they put people who are suffering from this in a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. So it's very high pressure to match the pressure they were at when they were first taking in all that nitrogen. And it's mostly with oxygen, so that eventually all that nitrogen that's in your blood outgasses, and you can go back to breathing normal air. And then carbon monoxide poisoning. Carbon monoxide is a byproduct of burning and combustion, and it affects the ability of oxygen to bind in the electron transport chain, and causes serious problems, including death. A few blood disorders. I'm not going to go into these in much detail, but you should review these as you go through the chapter. Anemia is another blood disorder that you hear about quite frequently, and this is having a low number of erythrocytes. The most common is an iron deficiency anemia. Your iron is insufficient due to poor diet or poor absorption. And then you have a few other types of anemia as well. So the other type of anemia that you probably have heard of is sickle cell anemia. And that is a genetic abnormality where your blood cells end up being sickle shaped. Okay, and this actually has some benefits if you're in areas where there's high levels of malaria. But these blood cells can interfere with blood flow. And thalassemia is a genetic abnormality, and this is from very specific geographic regions, but it causes reduced hemoglobin production. Okay? So a few different issues. And then bloodborne diseases, so malaria. And I know malaria quite well because I had it when I was in my 30s. It took years for me to get rid of it. But it's a parasitic disease transmitted by a mosquito bite. And once the protist is in your body, it causes your red blood cells to rupture. And so it's prevalent in certain geographic areas, mostly in the tropics nowadays, but it actually was resident in the United States as far north as Michigan historically. Sepsis is when you have a bacterial infection in your blood, and this is very serious. And then septicemia is when you have bacteria that enter the blood system. That often then leads to sepsis, and that sepsis can be fatal. In fact, my sister died from sepsis about 4 years ago. So some diagnostic procedures of the blood system. So blood tests are ways that you can find out if people have certain diseases, certain levels of molecules in their body. And this is often done through puncturing a vein and drawing out the blood, and then they centrifuge it down, separate the plasma and the cellular parts, and then test for things like sugar concentrations or red blood cell counts or white blood cell counts. So some different ones. A CBC is a complete blood count where you'll get all of the different blood cell types. Comprehensive Medical Panel, CMP, is 14 tests for kidney function and liver function, levels of glucose, calcium, electrolytes, and proteins in your body. Basal Metabolic Panel is BMP, and that's 7 tests for kidney function and electrolytes. BUN is blood urea nitrogen, and that can indicate kidney problems. And ABG is arterial blood gases, and that can be either lung or kidney problems. And those are things that you can diagnose with that. ESR is a sedimentation rate, the erythrocyte sedimentation rate, and that can indicate inflammation. HCT is your hematocrit percentage. So that's the percentage of the red blood cells in the blood, may indicate a disorder. Then lipid panels, and this is what you get your cholesterol checked with, and that's to figure out whether you have things like high cholesterol. And ProTime, or prothrombin time, checks the time it takes for the blood to clot. Okay. Then there's some urine tests that they can also do instead of drawing blood. The Schilling test allows you to test for whether B12 absorption works in diagnosing pernicious anemia. And then if you're not able to, or if this doesn't give enough answers, they do bone marrow biopsies, and they do this by sticking a needle into the pelvis usually, and they will draw out blood marrow and use that to figure out if you're having things, certain types of cancer and other things like that.